Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. The argument from divine infinity. The argument from divine infinity proves the existence of God by demonstrating that no finite being can be self-sufficient or self-existent, but must depend on infinite being as its ultimate source, which we call God. Limitation in a being's nature always requires some higher cause outside of that being, because no thing can determine its own nature to possess this or that degree of perfection and no other. If it did, it would then be at once cause and effect of its own self. By the same token, if the cause is itself finite, it requires still another cause, because a causal chain where all members are only finite in nature can never contain an adequate cause for any of the members. Ultimately, there must be an infinite source that possesses the perfection in question, not from another or by participation, but of its own nature and in unlimited fullness. From this infinite source, all the finite possessors of an attribute receive it or participate in it, each according to its own finite capacity. We call this infinite being God. So the argument from infinite divinity asks the question, where does a finite being get its limitations? So for instance, this can of soda is a finite being, meaning it has a finite size and shape and certain characteristics about it. They're finite, they're not endless. So where did it come from? What decided that this can would have this particular finiteness? Was it the can that decided that? No, of course not. A can would have to exist before it existed in order to decide its own finite limitations. Has this can always existed? Well, of course not. But even if it did, it still doesn't explain how these particular finite characteristics of this can were decided. How did that happen? So, the universe and the cosmos are full of finite objects. That's in fact all there is finite objects, finite beings. In fact, the entire universe and cosmos is a finite being comprised of other finite beings. So you can ask this question about every finite being in the cosmos and in the universe. How was it determined that it would have this particular finiteness about it? And the only plausible answer is that it got it from a source that is itself infinite. That is, that itself is uncaused. Because if it was finite, then something would have to determine its limitations, which means something caused it. So the argument is there has to be a source of infinite being that is responsible for giving all finite beings their particular limitations. And if you took all the finite beings in the universe, those finite beings would still not be able to account for all the finite limitations in the universe. There would still be a need for an appeal to something infinite that could decide on these finite limitations. Okay, and that infinite being we call God. If you want a symbol for this particular cosmological argument, I would use this. Now, this is two infinity signs interconnecting vertically and horizontally. And that's to show that whether you look at the finite limitations of reality in whatever direction you want to look at it, vertically or horizontally, it still points to an infinite source. which is God. Um, all right. Well, I hope you learned something about this, and take care.